Now I want to spend my time with you specifically talking about the important aspect of the report, which is, the calling out of investors' hypocrisy and the need for investors to rethink their dealings in areas of the world where there are clear human rights abuses and malign actors. I hope you'll bear with me. I want to give a little bit of background on ESG investing because it's become very fashionable today. Some $35 trillion, $1 in $3 in the world, is invested supposedly in a way that's compatible with ESG standards. But I think often it seems very confusing and there's lots of acronyms and so forth, and I just want to take you back a little bit. So the concept of socially responsible investing is nothing new. It dates back to the 1800s, to the Quakers and Methodists who devised some principles for their investments to avoid harm and to do good. And then things changed a bit over the time, obviously, but it was really quite recently, 20 years or so ago, that this concept of SRI, socially responsible investing, sort of morphed into what's now called ESG, environmental, social and governance concepts. Now the view, I think, is just the same, but it's a slightly more neutral, less ethical, less religious sounding concept. But obviously, in my view anyway, you still have to invest according to judgments about things that you value, standards of behaviour. These are issues that you can't analyse just on the numbers alone. Now, 15 years ago, again, to get across this idea that nothing is new about this, the UN set out 6 investment principles, and those were designed to reflect 2 core beliefs: that ESG issues affect the financials of a company ultimately, or countries, and that applying these principles may better align investors with the right objectives of society. Now, money talks, as we've already heard, and as Ben pointed out, this is money from your pension fund or your bank account. We're not talking about some arcane, esoteric, far-removed source of capital. So you are supporting, whether you like it or not, companies and countries around the world that you might not agree with. And the institutional investors who manage your money sign up to be stewards of that money. This is not their money. And they have a duty, a fiduciary duty, to act in your long-term best interests. Those UN principles for responsible investment are designed specifically to help them do that. And they commit us to incorporate ESG decisions into investment decisions, to be active owners, to seek disclosure and to report. And they're quite specific about those responsibilities. Now, no one is forced to sign up, but today there are over 4,000 signatories, voluntary signatories to the UN PRI. They represent over $100 trillion. Now, when we say money talks, well, this amount of money really can speak volumes. It really can change what happens, as Ian has so eloquently pointed out. And many institutional investors make a huge deal of their involvement, their signature to these principles. They laud it on their websites, they describe it when they're pitching for new business. And then a decade ago, the UN went further and it defined institutional investors' responsibility when it comes specifically to human rights. And they published something called the Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And those principles make it very clear what investors need to do to uphold human rights. And they should take necessary steps to cease, to prevent or mitigate adverse human rights impacts. Not just because it's right, which we would all agree with, but because if they contribute to abuses, they'll also be exposed to material, legal, financial and reputational risks. And if they discover violations, they are expected to provide access to remedy. Now, in case anyone still wasn't quite sure specifically what they needed to do, in 2017, the UN published a Guiding Principles for Reporting Framework on Human Rights, and just over a year ago, a document, Why and How Investors Should Act on Human Rights. And they set out in further detail what investors should do. Now, I tell you all of this, not to hopefully bore you to death, but to make it absolutely clear that the consideration of human rights issues when it comes to investing is not new. It is not something investors could claim not to have had the chance to think about. Neither is it something they could say is very vague, or just nice to have, or in any way subordinate to other ESG principles. The fact is that ESG has often just been interpreted as the E for environment. There's nothing to suggest, as US Speaker Nancy Pelosi has, that human rights are less important than, say, climate change. She's no friend of China's, but in a speech at Cambridge recently, she actually listed the Uyghur genocide, violation of the cultural and religious priority of Tibet, suppression of democracy in Hong Kong, all of which were just getting worse. And then she said, having said all that, climate change is the number one issue. So how can one set of fundamental principles, the most basic, our human rights, be cast aside simply because it might be inconvenient in the fight against climate change, or because they might get in the way of a short-term financial gain? Policy chair of the very powerful City of London Corporation, Catherine McGuinness, said this year, that it's really not clear that it's our place to actually be taking a position on Uyghur Muslims. If it came up in a meeting or something, then of course we'd express our views. But frankly, we tend to be talking about business issues. Now, the corporation held a vote which was upheld last year to censor the Chinese government for imposing the draconian security laws on Hong Kongers and to welcome the 2.9 million that have been offered British visas. But Catherine McGuinness voted against the motion, saying she would not censor Beijing as China is an important market for UK financial and related professional services. Now, I don't want to single her out as such. I'm afraid this view is quite widely shared and perhaps not always expressed. As Charles Moore pointed out in yesterday's Telegraph, and Ian has alluded to in terms of the reference to effectively appeasement, in one way, our appeasement of China is much more tempting than it was of Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia. There's lots more money in it. But such appeasement cannot be reconciled with ESG principles, with socially responsible investing, with upholding democracy. And we do it in other areas. There are tough anti-money laundering laws to stop investors financing terrorism and drug dealing, even if that might be very lucrative. We don't invest in certain types of ammunition. Cluster munitions, for example, are banned from investments because it's agreed widely that they are atrocious. But institutional investors, those signatories to the UNPRI, are today, as has been set out, investing in companies and countries who are known to be abusing human rights. Now, there are so many examples, it's impossible to square the circle, and Ben has talked about Larry Fink, so I will drop mentioning him again from my talk in case he feels got at. But HSBC, for example, prides itself, and it's all over their website, it's mentioned in the report, on its courageous integrity. Now, I've been working with that company on a number of issues linked to diversity and inclusion, and the people I'm working with are amongst the most committed to that issue. But its top management has been trying to ingratiate itself with the CCP, freezing assets of Hong Kong democratic campaigners, not allowing those who've moved here to access their pensions.
Yep.
And they say they're abiding by the rules, they are obeying orders, but surely, if there's one thing we've learned over history is that is no defense. These are lines that cannot be crossed if we are to have courageous integrity. Now, George Soros criticized BlackRock's actions. Let's bring it up to what we can do about it. He said that the firm pouring billions of dollars into China is a tragic mistake. He suggested very openly in the Wall Street Journal that the firm will lose money, damage US national security interests, and ours, of course. He said that China is not an area for investors to engage with, that the regime regards all Chinese companies as instruments of the state. Now, from an investment standpoint, he's brought it out into the mainstream, this question, which is fantastic. And from an investment standpoint, we might now have a moment where the financials, the threat to our worldview and democracy, and the human rights issues all finally stack up in the same direction. The new Common Prosperity Program, launched by President Xi, has already brought, of course, Evergrande to the brink, and other heavily indebted Chinese property companies are in big trouble. This may be the moment. It's not how you and I would want this to be triggered, but this may be the moment for those who have turned the blind eye to human atrocities to exit. I think the peak we've seen in investments in China, the $800 billion that the report outlines, which was in August this year, which was the moment that BlackRock said, treble your money, might well prove the peak. As the Common Prosperity regime, coupled with the chickens coming home to roost problem in the over-indebted property sector, puts people off and gets them thinking about what they're doing with their money and asks for more. We must take this moment, as the commercial case is undermined, to talk very loudly, and that's why I'm so delighted to be here tonight, to reassert the importance of human rights, to challenge the investment community. If ESG is to mean anything, it must surely start with human rights, not ignore or downplay them. So just finally, a couple of the positive actions. So as I said, money talks. In 2008, a long time ago now, Primark sacked 3 of its clothing suppliers in India after it was exposed that they were subcontracting to child workers. At Newton, where I was CEO at the time, we had a big position in Primark. It was a big subject of conversation for with us and the company. We said we would divest if they didn't do something. Boohoo became the unacceptable face of fast fashion last year. The company's actions failed to convince most investors, and the share price is now just about half of what it was before the sweatshop scandal. And there is great work. I want you to draw your attention to the Investor Alliance for Human Rights. It has 160 members representing more than $5 trillion, and it's been working with some of the best leading investors in this space to do what's right. In July, 86 investors signed a statement on human rights and business activities in Myanmar, for example. They're working hard on the human rights issues in China. They're pressing companies, especially clothing companies like H&M and Zara's owner, to look more carefully at its supply chain. But it's a long, hard battle ahead. Companies often clam up when challenged. Together, it's a battle that we can win. Thank you.